Welcome, everyone. Let's start today's lecture with a broad question. What is deviance? Deviance simply means breaking the rules. More precisely, it's the violation of recognized cultural norms. These norms are the shared expectations within a society about how people should behave, think, or even appear. When someone steps outside of those expectations, whether through actions, beliefs, or even just being different in some way, that's considered deviant. Now, not all deviance is the same. One clear category is crime, which is a specific kind of deviance. Crime involves breaking formal laws, those that are officially written and enforced by the legal system. So while all crimes are considered deviant, not all deviant behavior is criminal. But here's where it gets interesting. Deviance isn't always about what someone does. Sometimes it's about how they're perceived. A person might be labeled as deviant simply because of their attitude, beliefs, or identity, even if they haven't done anything harmful or illegal. What all forms of deviance have in common is that element of difference, something that makes others see a person as outside the norm or as an outsider. So, how does society respond to deviance? That brings us to the idea of social control. This is how society tries to regulate people's behavior and even their thoughts to encourage conformity and discourage deviance. Social control can be informal, like disapproval from friends or family, or formal, like punishments handed down through the legal system. When deviance crosses the line into criminal behavior, the response often comes from the criminal justice system. This includes the police, courts, and prison officials. Basically, the institutions responsible for enforcing laws and handling those accused of breaking them. Together, these ideas, deviance, crime, social control, and the criminal justice system, help us understand not just how society reacts to rule breaking, but also how those rules are shaped, enforced, and sometimes challenged. Let's take a look at how deviance has been explained from a biological perspective, especially in the early days of criminology. In the past, there was a strong belief that deviance and criminal behavior could be traced back to biology. One of the earliest theories came from Lombroso, who suggested that criminals were basically evolutionary throwbacks. He believed you could identify a criminal just by looking at certain physical traits, things like low foreheads, prominent jaws, and protruding ears. This idea was taken seriously for a time, but later studies, like those by Charles Goring, found no real evidence to back it up. A bit later, William Sheldon introduced a different biological theory. He claimed that body type could predict criminality. According to him, people with a more muscular or athletic build were more likely to engage in criminal behavior. Researchers like the Glucks supported this to some extent, but they were careful not to overstate it. They emphasized that having a strong build doesn't cause someone to be criminal. Other factors, especially social ones, play a big role too. So what about today? Modern genetic research is still exploring possible links between biology and criminal behavior. Some findings suggest that biological traits, when combined with certain environmental factors, like poverty, family background, or exposure to violence, can increase the risk of serious crime or violence later in life. So there may be a connection, but it's definitely not the whole story. One of the biggest limitations of biological theories is that they don't explain why certain behaviors are considered deviant in the first place. Just because someone has a biological predisposition doesn't tell us why society reacts to their behavior the way it does. These theories can't really account for the social processes that define what's normal and what's not. And that's where sociology starts to step in more clearly. Now let's shift from biology to psychology and take a look at how personality might play a role in deviant behavior. Psychological theories often focus on how personality is shaped by social experiences, things like upbringing, peer influence, and early childhood environment. One well-known example is containment theory, developed by Walter Reckless and Simon Dinitz. They wanted to understand why some boys growing up in high-crime neighborhoods stayed out of trouble while others didn't. In their study, they found that the boys who avoided delinquency, what they called the good boys, tended to have a strong conscience, clear moral standards, and a positive self-image. On the other hand, the bad boys often showed weaker internal controls and ended up having more encounters with the law. They were also more likely to come from areas where delinquency was common, which is why the researchers named their idea containment theory. The idea is that some kids are better contained from deviant behavior because of their internal strengths, even when they live in tough environments. But here's something important to keep in mind. Most serious crimes are actually committed by people who are considered psychologically normal. That tells us that while personality traits like self-control and moral values can influence someone's choices, they don't fully explain why people engage in deviant or criminal behavior. In the end, psychological theories give us part of the picture, but not the whole story. Just like biological theories, they help us understand some individual differences, but they don't tell us much about how society defines or reacts to deviance in the first place. That's where we need to bring in a broader sociological perspective. Now that we've looked at biological and psychological perspectives, let's shift to the sociological view, which is really the core of how we study deviance in this course. Sociology approaches deviance not as something rooted just in the individual, but as something shaped by society itself. In fact, there are three key ideas that help us understand the social foundations of deviance. First, deviance varies according to cultural norms. What one society sees as deviant might be totally acceptable in another. Even within the same society, ideas about what's normal can change over time. This tells us that deviance is relative. It depends on the cultural context. So the behavior itself isn't inherently deviant. It becomes deviant only when it clashes with the norms of a particular group or society. Second, people become deviant as others define them that way. This means deviance isn't just about what someone does, it's also about how others react. If someone gets labeled as deviant, that label can shape how others treat them, and over time, how they see themselves. In this way, deviance is socially constructed. It's created through interaction and judgment. And third, how societies set norms and define rule breaking often reflects social power. In other words, those who have more power, whether it's political, economic, or cultural, are usually the ones deciding what counts as deviant or criminal. This isn't just about keeping order, it's about maintaining control. The rules often reflect the values and interests of the dominant groups, and that influences who gets labeled as deviant and who doesn't. So the sociological perspective shows us that deviance isn't just about breaking the rules. It's also about who makes the rules, how they're enforced, and who benefits from the way deviance is defined. Next, let's take a look at deviance from a structural functional point of view. This approach doesn't just see deviance as a problem or a threat to social order. Instead, it argues that deviance actually serves important functions for society. One of the key insights here is that deviance isn't some strange or abnormal thing that just disrupts social life. According to this perspective, deviance is a normal and even necessary part of how society operates. It helps maintain social order in some unexpected ways. There are four main functions that deviance performs, and they all help reinforce the structure of society. First, responding to deviance helps clarify moral boundaries. When someone breaks a rule, the way society reacts, whether it's through disapproval, punishment, or even debate, reaffirms what's considered right and wrong. It's like holding up a mirror to our moral standards and reinforcing them. Second, deviance affirms cultural values and norms. By identifying certain behaviors as deviant, society reaffirms the values that most people share. It reminds everyone what the expected standards are and why they matter. Third, when society responds to deviance, it often brings people together. Shared reactions to deviance, like shock, outrage, or even solidarity, can strengthen social bonds. Think of how communities come together in response to crimes, protests, or even disasters. These moments can create a sense of unity and shared purpose. And finally, deviance encourages social change. Some of the biggest shifts in society have started with people who broke the rules. Movements for civil rights, labor reform, or gender equality were all once seen as deviant. By challenging the status quo, deviance can push society to grow and evolve. So, from a structural functional perspective, deviance isn't just about people behaving badly. It plays a key role in defining norms, reinforcing values, creating social cohesion, and even driving progress. Now let's dive into Robert Merton's strain theory, which gives us another way to understand why deviance happens. Not because people are bad or biologically different, but because of the way society is structured. Merton argued that deviance often results from a disconnect between the goals society encourages, like wealth and success, and the legitimate means available to achieve those goals. In our culture, there's a strong push toward material success, but not everyone has the same access to education, stable jobs, or social connections that can help them get there. This gap between the goal and the means creates strain, especially for people in disadvantaged positions. And when the pressure builds, some people respond to that strain with deviant behavior, like theft, drug dealing, or other street crimes, as alternative ways to reach those goals. Merton identified 5 different ways people respond to this strain, depending on whether they accept or reject society's goals and the accepted ways of reaching them. The first is conformity. Most people fall into this category. They pursue cultural goals like financial success, and they do it through socially approved means like education and hard work. Next is innovation. This is where someone accepts the goals, say, getting rich, but uses unconventional or illegal means to get there. A drug dealer or scam artist might fit into this category. They want the same success society values, but they take a different, often criminal path to get it. Then there's ritualism. These are people who have more or less given up on the goal of material success, but they still follow the rules to the letter. Think of someone who goes through the motions at a job with no hope or desire for upward mobility. They stick to the system, even if they don't really believe in it anymore. Retreatism is a more extreme response. These individuals reject both the goals and the means. They essentially drop out of society, often turning to substance use, isolation, or other forms of withdrawal from mainstream life. Finally, we have rebellion. Rebels reject both the established goals and the accepted means, but unlike retreatists, they don't just drop out. They try to create an alternative system altogether, like pushing for new values and structures. This might include countercultural groups or political movements that challenge the status quo. So strain theory helps us see deviance as a product of inequality and blocked opportunity, not just individual failure. It highlights how social structure can push people toward different paths, some conforming, some resisting, and some redefining the rules entirely. Building on Merton's strain theory, let's look at how deviance can take different forms, depending on the opportunities people have access to. This brings us to the work of Cloward and Olin, who argued that it's not just a lack of access to legitimate opportunities that matters. Access to illegitimate opportunities also plays a big role in shaping deviant behavior. According to them, people don't just randomly choose a deviant path. The kind of deviance someone engages in often depends on what kinds of deviant subcultures are available in their environment. They identified 3 main types of deviant subcultures. The first is criminal subcultures. These develop in areas where there's already an established network of organized crime. In these settings, people, especially young people, can learn how to commit crimes from others. It's almost like an underground apprenticeship where the skills, norms, and connections needed for criminal activity are passed down. Next are conflict subcultures. These emerge in areas where there's little access to either legitimate jobs or organized crime networks. In these environments, young people might turn to violence or form gangs as a way to gain respect, assert dominance, or create a sense of identity. It's more about expressing frustration and gaining status in a world where few opportunities exist. Finally, there are retreatist subcultures. These are made up of individuals who've basically dropped out of both the legitimate and illegitimate opportunity structures. They're not striving for success through work or crime. They've withdrawn from it all. This often involves drug use or other forms of escape from mainstream society. Let's expand a bit more on deviant subcultures by looking at a few other important perspectives that help explain how and why certain groups turn to deviance. Albert Cohen focused on how deviance can be a reaction to blocked opportunities, especially among lower-class youth. He argued that when young people don't have access to the same resources or pathways to success, like quality education or good jobs, they often experience deep frustration. Instead of following the rules of a system they feel excluded from, some of them turn to delinquent behavior. In a way, deviance becomes a way to gain status or a sense of achievement in a society that doesn't seem to offer them legitimate ways to succeed. Walter Miller took this idea further by identifying 6 key characteristics often found in deviant subcultures, especially in lower-income environments. These traits help shape the everyday lives and values of people growing up in these settings. First, there's trouble, a common experience of conflict with authority figures, whether that's parents, teachers, or the police. Then there's toughness, which emphasizes physical strength and aggression, especially among young men. Smartness is about being streetwise, the ability to con, manipulate, or outsmart others. Excitement reflects a constant search for thrills, danger, and risk-taking. Fate is the belief that life is out of one's control, that outcomes are determined by luck or external forces. And finally, freedom shows up as a strong resistance to authority and rules, often coming from a deep resentment of the limitations placed on them by society. Elijah Anderson offered another layer to this discussion with his work on the code of the street. In some poor urban neighborhoods, young men grow up facing neglect and hostility from mainstream institutions, things like schools, law enforcement, and even basic public services. Because they don't feel protected or respected by society, they develop a different kind of code to survive. In this code, being aggressive and showing nerve, standing up to threats, not backing down, using force when necessary, becomes essential for earning respect and protecting yourself. It's not just about violence. It's about survival in a world where the usual paths to success feel completely out of reach. Next, we will shift gears and look at deviance from a symbolic interaction perspective. This approach zooms in on the micro level, on everyday interactions, and asks, how do people define and respond to deviance in real time? Unlike the structural functional approach, which looks at the big picture role deviance plays in maintaining social order, symbolic interaction focuses on how deviance is created and understood through social interaction. It's less about what someone does and more about how others react to it. One of the most important ideas from this perspective is labeling theory. This theory suggests that deviance isn't so much about the act itself, but about how people label that act. In other words, an action becomes deviant only when society responds to it that way. It's the reaction that matters. Labeling theory makes a key distinction between primary and secondary deviance. Primary deviance refers to minor rule breaking, things like skipping class or shoplifting once. These actions might go unnoticed or be brushed off, and they usually don't have a lasting impact on someone's identity. But secondary deviance is different. This is what happens when someone continues to break norms and begins to take on a deviant identity, often because of how others respond. For example, if a person who shoplifts is labeled a thief, and that label sticks, it can start to shape how they see themselves and how others treat them. Over time, they might continue that behavior, not just because of the act itself, but because of the label they've internalized. This brings us to the concept of stigma. A stigma is a powerful negative label that can dramatically alter a person's self-concept and how others interact with them. It becomes what we call a master status, a label so dominant that it overshadows everything else about the person. For example, once someone is labeled a criminal, that label can follow them everywhere, even after they've served their sentence or changed their behavior. One way stigma is applied is through what's known as a degradation ceremony. This is a public event or process where someone is officially labeled in a way that marks them as deviant. A criminal trial is a good example. It's not just about guilt or innocence, but about labeling someone in a way that has lasting social consequences. So from the symbolic interaction point of view, deviance isn't just about rules being broken. It's about how society defines and responds to those rule breakers. And often it's the reaction that ends up shaping the deviant behavior more than the original act itself. Let's dig a little deeper into the power of labels and how they shape our understanding of deviance, not just in the moment, but across time. Once someone is labeled as deviant, that label doesn't just stay in the present, It often reaches into their past and even into their future. This is where two important ideas come in: retrospective labeling and projective labeling. Retrospective labeling happens when people start to reinterpret someone's past in light of their deviant label. So, for instance, if someone is labeled a criminal, people might go back and say, oh, well, they always had a sneaky side, or that explains why they acted out in school. It's a way of rewriting someone's history to make it fit the label. Projective labeling, on the other hand, looks to the future. It's when people expect that someone who's been labeled deviant will continue to act that way. So even if the person tries to change, the label sticks and influences how others see their future behavior. This can trap someone in a cycle where their identity as a deviant keeps getting reinforced, making it really hard to break out of that role. One particularly bold critique of labeling comes from psychiatrist Thomas Sass. He argued that many people who are labeled mentally ill aren't actually ill. They're just different. His point was that society sometimes uses mental health labels to control or silence behavior that doesn't fit into the norm. In his view, calling someone mentally ill can sometimes be more about social control than medical reality. He even went so far as to say we should stop using the term mental illness because of how it can stigmatize and marginalize people unfairly. This leads us into the idea of the medicalization of deviance. This is when a type of deviant behavior, something that might once have been seen as immoral or criminal, is redefined as a medical issue. Take alcoholism as an example. It was once viewed purely as a moral failure or a crime, but today it's often treated as a disease. That shift in definition changes how we respond to it, from blame and punishment to treatment and support. Now, whether deviance is defined morally or medically has some big consequences. First, it affects who responds to the deviance. If it's seen as a moral problem, the police or the courts might get involved. If it's seen as a medical issue, then doctors, therapists, or treatment centers are the ones who take over. Second, it shapes how people respond. A moral definition usually brings judgment and punishment. A medical one often brings concern and a push for rehabilitation. And third, it affects how we view the deviant person's responsibility. Someone labeled as a criminal is usually seen as fully responsible for their actions, but someone diagnosed with a medical condition might be viewed as less accountable, as someone in need of help rather than punishment. Now, we will turn to another major idea from the symbolic interaction approach, Sutherland's differential association theory. This theory is all about how deviance is learned through social interaction. According to Sutherland, the key factor in whether someone conforms or becomes deviant isn't their personality, biology, or even social class. It's the people they spend time with. If a person is surrounded by others who support or encourage deviant behavior, they're more likely to adopt those behaviors themselves. In short, deviance isn't something people are born with. It's something they learn. This idea is especially powerful when we think about peer influence. For example, if a teenager is part of a friend group where stealing, skipping school, or drug use is common, they're more likely to take part in those same activities. The more time they spend with people who reject conventional norms, the more likely they are to start rejecting those norms too. So you can think of deviance as being kind of contagious. It spreads through close social connections. And that's what makes this theory so compelling. It shifts the focus from the individual to their environment, emphasizing just how powerful group influence can be in shaping behavior. Let's wrap up this section with control theory, developed by Travis Hershey. This theory takes a different angle. It doesn't focus on why people become deviant, but instead on why most people don't. Hershey argued that people conform to social norms not because they're naturally law-abiding or morally superior, but because of the social bonds that tie them to the community. When those bonds are strong, people are less likely to risk deviant behavior. But when those bonds are weak or broken, the chances of deviance go up. He identified 4 main types of social control that help keep people in line. The first is attachment. This is about strong emotional and social ties, like close relationships with parents, teachers, or peers. When someone feels connected to others, they're less likely to break the rules because they don't want to disappoint or lose those relationships. Next is opportunity. If a person has access to legitimate paths to success, like education, jobs, or a stable future, they have more to gain from staying on track. But if those opportunities feel out of reach, deviance can start to look like a more viable option. Third, there's involvement. Simply being busy with structured, socially accepted activities like school, sports, work, or volunteering can reduce the chance of deviance. The idea is straightforward. If you're engaged in positive activities, you don't have much time or energy for trouble. And finally, belief. When someone genuinely believes in the rules of society, like laws, moral standards, or respect for authority, they're more likely to follow them. It's about internalizing those norms so they guide behavior even when no one's watching. So overall, Hershey's control theory highlights the role of connection, structure, and belief in keeping people committed to social norms. It reminds us that conformity often depends not on who someone is, but on how connected and supported they feel within their community. Let's shift to a broader, more critical perspective, the social conflict approach. This lens focuses on how deviance is deeply connected to inequality in society. It asks a powerful question: who gets to decide what counts as deviant and who benefits from those definitions? According to this view, deviance isn't just about breaking rules, it's about power. Specifically, it's about how the unequal distribution of power influences who gets labeled as deviant and how society responds. This includes big picture social structures like class, race, and gender, which all shape how deviance is defined and enforced. One key idea here is that the norms and laws of any society usually reflect the interests of the rich and powerful. Those in positions of power often have the ability to shape laws, influence public opinion, and even avoid punishment. For example, wealthy individuals typically have access to high-quality legal representation. That means they're often able to escape harsh penalties for things that might land someone with fewer resources in serious trouble. Even more importantly, the legal system itself may not be as neutral as it claims to be. Many laws serve to protect the interests of the elite, whether it's laws that prioritize property over people or systems that punish poverty while overlooking white-collar crime. This raises a critical question: is our justice system truly fair, or does it reinforce the very inequalities it claims to address? So from a social conflict perspective, deviance is not just a matter of individual behavior. It's about how power operates through labels, laws, and institutions. It challenges us to think not just about what is considered deviant, but who gets to decide and why. Building on the social conflict perspective, let's take a closer look at how deviance operates within a capitalist system. Sociologist Stephen Spitzer offers an important insight here. He argues that people are more likely to be labeled as deviant if their behavior threatens the smooth functioning of capitalism. In other words, the system tends to label as deviant those who get in the way, especially those who challenge property rights, disrupt productivity, or question authority. Take theft, for example. Stealing is very clearly defined as a crime. But what about a landlord charging extremely high rent for a poorly maintained apartment? While that may be morally questionable, it's rarely labeled as deviant. In fact, it's often considered just business. That kind of discrepancy shows how the rules can be shaped to protect economic interests rather than fairness or justice. This perspective helps us see how capitalism influences our definitions of deviance. If an action harms the powerful or disrupts the flow of profit, it's much more likely to be criminalized. But if it harms vulnerable people while benefiting those in power, it's often accepted or even encouraged. So when we ask why certain behaviors are punished and others are ignored, we have to look beyond the surface. Capitalism doesn't just shape our economy, it also plays a big role in shaping what we call deviant. Now, let's look at how different types of crime reflect social inequality, starting with white-collar crime. White-collar crime refers to illegal acts committed by people in high-status positions during the course of their work. Think about crimes like embezzlement, insider trading, or tax evasion. These aren't violent crimes, and they often happen behind the scenes in offices or boardrooms. What's important here is that white-collar crimes are usually handled in civil courts, not criminal ones. That means the penalties tend to be financial, fines, settlements, or business restrictions, rather than jail time. Even when white-collar offenders are convicted, they rarely end up in prison. This stands in stark contrast to how street-level crimes, often committed by people from lower-income backgrounds, are punished. It's a clear example of how the justice system can treat people differently based on their class and social status. Closely related is corporate crime, which involves illegal actions committed by businesses or individuals acting on behalf of a corporation. This can include things like environmental pollution, financial fraud, or allowing unsafe working conditions. These crimes can have massive impacts, hurting workers, harming communities, or damaging the environment. But despite the scale of the harm, corporate crime is often treated much more lightly than individual crimes like theft or assault. Then there's organized crime, which involves illegal businesses that supply goods or services, things like drug trafficking, illegal gambling, or prostitution. Organized crime often develops in communities where legal opportunities are scarce. For some, it becomes a way to survive or succeed when the mainstream economy doesn't offer real options. So again, we see a connection between deviance and inequality, where people's opportunities or lack thereof shape the kinds of deviance they engage in. All of these examples, white-collar, corporate, and organized crime, show how deviance is not just about breaking rules. It's also about who breaks the rules, why, and how society responds. And often, those responses reveal deeper inequalities in power, privilege, and access to justice. Next, we'll take a closer look at how gender shapes the way we define and respond to deviance. Feminist theory highlights that deviance isn't judged in a vacuum. It's filtered through social expectations, especially around gender. Around the world, women are often subject to more stringent normative controls than men. What's considered appropriate behavior is much more narrowly defined for women, and stepping outside those expectations can lead to harsher judgment. A key point feminist theorists make is that whether something is seen as deviant doesn't just depend on the behavior itself. It depends on who's doing it and who's watching. The gender of both the person acting and the people observing plays a big role. For example, a behavior that might be seen as bold or assertive in a man could be judged as aggressive or inappropriate in a woman. In many cases, actions that are tolerated or even praised when done by men are considered deviant when done by women. And when women are labeled as deviant, the consequences can be more severe. This unequal treatment is often visible in the criminal justice system, where women may be judged not only for breaking the law, but also for violating traditional gender expectations. So gender norms don't just shape our personal behavior, they also shape how society defines, responds to, and punishes deviance. Feminist theory pushes us to recognize these double standards and consider how power and control operate through gender. Now let's take a deeper look at deviance and crime through the lens of critical race theory. This perspective doesn't just explore how race shapes individual experiences. It examines how systems and institutions are structured in ways that perpetuate racial inequality, especially within the criminal justice system. Critical race theory argues that the law and the way deviance is defined and enforced is not neutral. Instead, it reflects and reinforces the existing racial hierarchy. In this view, deviance is not just a matter of breaking rules, but of who gets to make the rules and how those rules are used to maintain power. A central insight here is that race and racism are deeply embedded in the fabric of legal, political, and economic systems. So when it comes to crime, it's not just about what people do, it's about who they are and how society responds based on their racial identity. Behaviors associated with marginalized racial groups are often criminalized, while similar actions by members of dominant groups are either overlooked or treated less severely. For example, Black and brown communities are disproportionately targeted by policing practices, such as stop and frisk, aggressive surveillance, or the war on drugs. These communities are also more likely to face harsher sentencing and have less access to fair legal representation. Meanwhile, white-collar crimes, often committed by white individuals in positions of power, receive comparatively light consequences, even when the harm is widespread. Critical race theory also highlights how deviance is socially constructed in ways that align with racial stereotypes. For instance, youth of color are more likely to be labeled as threats or gang members, while white youth engaging in similar behavior are more likely to be described as troubled or misguided. These narratives aren't accidental. They reflect deeply rooted cultural assumptions about race and criminality. Ultimately, critical race theory challenges us to see deviance and crime not just as issues of personal behavior, but as reflections of larger systems of racial power. It calls for a reevaluation of how laws are written, how justice is applied, and how race continues to shape every stage of the legal process, from labeling and policing to prosecution and punishment. While each sociological theory of crime and deviance offers important insights, they all come with limitations that affect how fully they explain the complexity of deviant behavior. Starting with structural functional theories, such as those by Durkheim and Merton, a major limitation is that they assume a shared consensus about norms across society. They often ignore the influence of power and inequality in shaping which behaviors are considered deviant. These theories also tend to overlook why some actions are criminalized while others are not, and they don't address who benefits from defining deviance in particular ways. Subcultural theories, including those from Cloward and Olin and Cohen, are often criticized for their narrow focus on working-class youth and urban environments. They risk reinforcing stereotypes about poor communities and ignore the structural factors, like racism, economic inequality, and policy, that contribute to the formation of deviant subcultures. They also don't fully explain deviance among more privileged groups or more organized forms of crime, like corporate or white-collar crime. Symbolic interaction theories, especially labeling theory, provide valuable insight into how deviance is socially constructed through interaction, but they fall short in several key areas. Labeling theory, for instance, is more effective in explaining minor forms of deviance than serious or systemic ones, like organized crime or corporate misconduct. It also doesn't explain why certain behaviors are labeled deviant in the first place, or why some individuals are labeled and others are not. Moreover, it assumes that being labeled always has a negative impact, when in reality, people respond to labels in very different ways depending on the context. Control theory emphasizes the role of social bonds in preventing deviance, but tends to focus on individual-level explanations. It assumes that everyone would be deviant if not for social constraint, which oversimplifies the motivations behind deviance. It also doesn't account for structural inequalities that weaken those social bonds in the first place, such as poverty, discrimination, or unequal access to education and employment. Social conflict theory, while powerful in highlighting the role of inequality in defining and enforcing deviance, can be overly deterministic. It often assumes that laws are created solely to serve the interests of the powerful, overlooking the fact that some laws do protect vulnerable populations. Additionally, this theory doesn't fully explain why crime exists in relatively egalitarian societies or why individuals from privileged backgrounds also commit deviant acts. Finally, critical race theory and feminist theory, while essential for understanding how race and gender shape deviant labeling and treatment, have their own challenges. These perspectives focus heavily on structural oppression and may underemphasize individual agency and variation within groups. They also raise complex questions, such as whether hate crime laws are punishing the act itself or the attitude behind it, issues that can be difficult to resolve within existing legal and sociological frameworks. In short, while each theory sheds light on different aspects of deviance, none of them offers a complete or universally applicable explanation. Their limitations highlight the need for a more integrated approach that considers individual behavior, social interaction, and broader structural forces all at once. Hate crimes offer a powerful example of how bias and inequality are embedded not just in institutions, but in the very acts of deviance we see in society. Critical race theory reminds us that crime and punishment are not experienced equally across racial and ethnic groups, and hate crimes make this imbalance especially visible. A hate crime refers to a criminal act against a person or their property that is motivated by racial or other bias. While anyone can be a victim, certain groups, especially racial, ethnic, religious, and sexual minorities, are disproportionately targeted. In Canada, hate crimes have been steadily rising in recent years, highlighting ongoing tensions around identity, belonging, and power. What makes hate crimes particularly significant in the study of deviance is that they aren't just individual offenses. They're symbolic acts meant to intimidate entire communities. They communicate who belongs and who doesn't, reinforcing broader patterns of exclusion and inequality. Hate crime laws are especially revealing because they don't just punish the behavior, they also address the motivation. If a crime is committed with bias against a particular group, the offender can receive a harsher sentence. That raises an important question. Are we punishing someone's actions, their attitudes, or both? In this sense, hate crime laws reflect a deeper social debate. On one hand, they recognize the added harm caused by bias-driven offenses. On the other, they challenge us to think carefully about how far the justice system should go in judging not just what people do, but why they do it. Let's now take a moment to define what we actually mean by crime. In legal terms, a crime involves two key components, the act itself and criminal intent, which is also known by the Latin term mens rea. In order for something to be considered a crime, both the action and the intent behind it need to be present. So it's not just about what someone does, but also about whether they meant to do it. Now, crimes can be grouped into three main categories, based on what or who is being harmed. First, we have crimes against the person. These are offenses that involve direct violence or the threat of violence toward another person. Examples include murder, assault, and robbery. These types of crimes are often considered the most serious because they involve physical harm or danger to human life. Second, there are crimes against property. These involve the theft or destruction of someone's possessions or land. Common examples include burglary, theft, and arson. While these don't always involve physical harm to a person, they still violate someone's rights and security. And finally, we have victimless crimes. These are a bit more complex because they involve actions that violate the law, but don't have a clear, direct victim. Things like drug use, prostitution, and illegal gambling fall into this category. The people involved may be consenting adults, and the harm is often seen as self-inflicted or social rather than individual. These crimes tend to be more controversial because they raise questions about morality, personal freedom, and the role of law in regulating private behavior. Understanding these categories helps us see how the legal system organizes different types of harm and how society prioritizes responses based on who or what is affected. Next, let's talk about criminal statistics, how we measure crime, and why we need to be cautious when interpreting the numbers. Most of the official crime data we see comes from police reports. But here's the catch. These numbers only reflect crimes that are actually reported and recorded by authorities. That means many crimes, especially things like domestic violence, sexual assault, or minor thefts, might go unreported and never show up in the statistics. So while official data is useful, it doesn't tell the full story. To get a better sense of the actual level of crime, researchers also rely on victimization surveys. These surveys ask people directly whether they've experienced crime, regardless of whether they reported it to the police. This method helps uncover the so-called dark figure of crime, the incidents that happen but aren't captured by official records. In terms of trends, crime rates in Canada rose steadily from the early 1960s and peaked around 1991. Since then, overall crime has been on the decline for the past couple of decades. But again, we need to keep in mind that these trends reflect reported crime, not all crime. So while the numbers may show a downward trend, some types of crime may still be underreported or shifting in ways that aren't fully captured. The key takeaway here is that crime statistics are useful, but they're only part of the picture. To truly understand crime patterns, we need to consider both reported data and the broader social context that influences what gets reported, what doesn't, and why. When we talk about who commits crime, there's no single profile, but there are some key social patterns that show up again and again in the data. Variables like age, gender, social class, and race or ethnicity all play a role in shaping both the likelihood of someone engaging in crime and their chances of being caught. Let's start with age. Crime is most common among young people, particularly those between the ages of 15 and 22. This is the age range where we see the highest rates of involvement in criminal behavior. But as people age, their involvement in crime tends to decrease. In fact, most people age out of criminal activity as they take on more responsibilities and gain stability in their lives. Gender is another strong predictor. In Canada, about 80% of all arrests are male, while only 21% are female. This gender gap has been consistent over time, especially for violent and street-level offenses. However, it's worth noting that women's involvement in certain types of crime, particularly property crime, has increased slightly in recent years. When it comes to social class, most recorded street crime is associated with lower-income individuals. People from economically disadvantaged backgrounds often live in neighborhoods with fewer resources, higher unemployment, and more police surveillance, all factors that contribute to both increased criminal behavior and increased likelihood of being arrested. But appearances can be deceiving. If we include white-collar crime, which often goes underreported and underpunished, the typical criminal looks more affluent and powerful. Race and ethnicity also factor into the picture, but the patterns are complex. In general, racialized groups tend to be underrepresented in official crime statistics in Canada. However, there are key exceptions. Members of Indigenous and Black communities are significantly overrepresented in both arrest data and prison populations. This overrepresentation isn't simply about individual behavior. It reflects broader social and structural inequalities. Race in Canada is also closely linked to socioeconomic status, and it's this connection that helps explain why some groups are more exposed to the risk factors associated with crime, like poverty, discrimination, limited access to education, and over-policing in certain communities. It's also important to remember that the same groups most often associated with committing crime, young people, men, and those from lower income backgrounds, are also the most likely to be victims of crime. That's a reminder that criminal behavior and victimization often exist within the same social conditions, showing how deeply interconnected these issues really are. Now let's step back and take a global view of crime. When we compare crime rates around the world, it becomes clear that national context, cultural values, legal systems, economic conditions plays a huge role in shaping patterns of criminal behavior. By global standards, Canada has a relatively low crime rate. This is especially true when we compare it to the United States, where both violent and property crime rates are significantly higher. In fact, violent crime rates in the US are several times higher than in much of Europe, and even more so when compared to many Asian countries. Japan, for example, consistently reports some of the lowest rates of violent and property crime in the world. This kind of comparison raises important questions about what factors contribute to such differences. Things like cultural emphasis on social harmony, strong community ties, and stricter gun laws seem to play a role. On the other end of the spectrum, crime rates are soaring in many large cities in the developing world. Rapid urbanization, poverty, political instability, and weak legal enforcement contribute to rising levels of crime in places where public resources are stretched thin. Globally, some types of crime have always been multinational. The drug trade, for instance, involves complex international networks of production, trafficking, and distribution. Terrorism also transcends borders, making crime prevention a global concern that requires international cooperation. There's also a noticeable global trend when it comes to criminal justice policy. Many countries are moving toward abolishing capital punishment and restricting gun ownership. Canada is part of this trend. The United States, however, stands out as an exception, both in its continued use of the death penalty and its relatively open approach to firearm access. So when we look at crime from a global perspective, we see that it's not just about individual behavior, it's about broader social, economic, and cultural conditions that shape how crime occurs and how societies respond. Let's now take a closer look at the Canadian criminal justice system and how it's structured to ensure fairness and protect individual rights. At the heart of this system is the principle of procedural fairness and the rule of law. These ideas were formally introduced in 1960 through the Canadian Bill of Rights and became more deeply embedded in 1982 with the introduction of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Together, these legal frameworks are designed to ensure that anyone accused of a crime is treated fairly, regardless of who they are or what they've been charged with. Central to this system is the concept of fundamental justice. This refers to the basic legal protections that must be in place for a trial to be considered fair. There are three key rights that every person charged with a crime in Canada is guaranteed. First, there is the right to fair notice. This means that the accused must be clearly informed of the legal proceedings and the charges against them. There can't be any surprises. They need to know exactly what they're facing. Second, there is the right to present a defense. The accused must have a real opportunity to respond to the charges, to speak on their own behalf, and to challenge the evidence presented against them. And importantly, the hearing itself must follow proper legal procedures. Third, there is the right to an impartial judge or jury. This means the case must be heard by a decision maker who weighs the evidence fairly without bias and without influence from outside pressure. All of these principles work together to protect the rights of the accused and maintain public confidence in the justice system. Fundamental justice ensures that legal decisions aren't arbitrary, that they're based on clear rules, fair procedures, and respect for individual rights. The police are often the first point of contact between the public and the criminal justice system. When a crime is reported or suspected, it's the police who respond, assess the situation, and decide what actions to take. But that decision-making process involves a lot of discretion, meaning officers have to make judgment calls based on the specifics of each case. So what influences whether or not someone gets arrested? There are several key factors that officers typically consider. First, how serious is the crime? More serious offenses are obviously more likely to result in arrest, especially if there's an immediate threat to public safety. Second, what does the victim want? In many cases, the police will take into account whether the victim wants to press charges or is looking for another resolution, like restitution or mediation. Third, is the suspect cooperative? A person who complies with officers is often treated more leniently than someone who resists, argues, or tries to flee. Fourth, has the suspect been arrested before? If someone has a history of offenses, police may be more inclined to make an arrest, especially if it appears to be a pattern of behavior. Fifth, are there bystanders present? The presence of witnesses can affect how officers act, especially if the situation is unfolding in a public space where others are watching. And finally, what is the suspect's race or ethnicity? Unfortunately, this is where bias can come into play. Studies have shown that racial profiling and systemic bias do influence police behavior in some cases. Visible minorities are often subject to greater scrutiny and are more likely to be stopped, questioned, or arrested, even when the circumstances are similar to those involving white suspects. So while police discretion is a necessary part of law enforcement, it also opens the door to potential inequalities. Understanding how these decisions are made and who they affect is a key part of analyzing the broader justice system. Once someone is arrested, their case moves into the court system, which is responsible for determining guilt or innocence. While many people imagine trials with lawyers, witnesses, and juries, the reality is that most criminal cases never actually go to trial. Instead, many are resolved through a process called plea bargaining. This is a legal negotiation where the prosecution agrees to reduce the charges or recommend a lighter sentence in exchange for the defendant pleading guilty. Plea bargaining is widely used because it helps reduce court backlogs and moves cases through the system more efficiently. But while plea bargaining can speed things up, it also comes with serious concerns. First, it can pressure defendants to plead guilty even when they may be innocent or have a legitimate defense. Faced with the risk of a much harsher sentence if they go to trial and lose, some people agree to plead guilty just to avoid the uncertainty. Second, plea deals can result in inadequate or lenient sentences, especially if key facts about the case don't come out until after the deal is made. This raises concerns about justice being served, especially in more serious or complex cases. So, while courts are meant to uphold fairness and determine guilt or innocence, the widespread use of plea bargaining reveals some of the compromises and challenges built into the system. Now let's talk about punishment, why we punish offenders and what roles punishment serves in society. There are 4 main justifications for punishment, each rooted in a different goal or philosophy. First, there's retribution. This is about moral vengeance, making sure the punishment fits the crime. It's not focused on preventing future crimes, but on delivering justice by ensuring that the offender suffers in proportion to the harm they caused. It's society's way of expressing that certain behaviors are unacceptable and must be answered for. Second, we have deterrence. This approach tries to prevent future crime by instilling fear of punishment. There are 2 types. Specific deterrence targets the individual offender, aiming to convince them that committing another crime isn't worth the risk. General deterrence is aimed at society more broadly. When one person is punished, it sends a message to others that they, too, could face consequences if they break the law. Third is rehabilitation. Instead of punishing for the sake of pain or fear, rehabilitation focuses on changing the offender's behavior so they won't commit crimes in the future. This might involve education, therapy, addiction treatment, or job training. The goal is reintegration, helping individuals become functioning members of society again. And fourth, we have societal protection. This is about preventing further harm by removing offenders from society. It can be temporary, through imprisonment, or permanent, through measures like the death penalty. Now, while all of these justifications have their place, punishment doesn't always work as intended. One major issue is recidivism, the tendency of people to reoffend after being released. High recidivism rates suggest that prisons aren't always effective at changing long-term behavior. And when it comes to the death penalty, research shows that it has limited impact as a general deterrent. It doesn't consistently lead to lower crime rates, despite being the most extreme form of punishment. So, while punishment is a central part of the criminal justice system, it's also one that raises important questions about fairness, effectiveness, and what kind of society we want to build. We'll now turn specifically to the death penalty, which remains one of the most controversial forms of punishment. The main argument in favor of capital punishment is that it deters the most serious crimes, especially murder. The logic is simple. If the consequences are extreme, people will think twice before committing a crime. But research tells a different story. Opponents of the death penalty often point out that it has limited value as a deterrent. In fact, many studies have found no clear evidence that the death penalty reduces crime more effectively than life imprisonment. Canada, for example, abolished the death penalty decades ago, and since then, the murder rate has not increased. This suggests that other factors like social policy, policing, or economic conditions may play a much greater role in reducing crime than the threat of execution. In countries that still use capital punishment, like the United States, the debate continues. Supporters often argue it's a necessary tool for justice and public safety, while critics raise serious ethical concerns, especially when it comes to the risk of executing innocent people or the unequal way it's applied across racial and economic lines. While punishment in general can deter some crime, and prison may offer short-term protection by removing offenders from society, long-term rehabilitation is far less certain, especially under harsh or punitive conditions. When it comes to the death penalty, the evidence suggests that it may do little to actually prevent crime and raises difficult moral and legal questions about justice, fairness, and human rights. Let's finish by looking at an important alternative to traditional incarceration, community-based corrections. These are correctional programs that allow offenders to serve their sentences while remaining in the community rather than behind bars. This approach is becoming more common in Canada, partly to reduce the financial and social costs of imprisonment, but also to offer more rehabilitative options. There are three main types of community-based corrections used in Canada. First, we have probation. This allows an offender to stay in the community under court-ordered supervision. The individual must follow certain conditions, like maintaining employment, attending counseling or rehab programs, and checking in regularly with a probation officer. It's designed to keep people out of jail while still holding them accountable. Second is parole. This applies to offenders who have already served part of their sentence in prison and are then released to complete the rest in the community. Parole is meant to ease the transition from prison back into society with supervision from a parole officer. It gives the individual some freedom while still monitoring their behavior to prevent reoffending. And third, there's sentencing circles, which are a unique and culturally specific approach rooted in Indigenous justice practices. In a sentencing circle, the offender, the victim, community members, and elders come together to talk through what happened and work toward a resolution that focuses on healing. The goal here is restorative justice, repairing harm, rebuilding relationships, and preventing future offenses through community involvement and support. Now, community-based corrections have shown mixed results. On the positive side, they are significantly less expensive than prison and can give people a real chance to change their behavior in a familiar environment. They also help reduce the negative social impacts of incarceration, like family separation and loss of employment. But the challenge is that these programs don't always reduce recidivism. Some individuals do commit new offenses even after going through probation, parole, or restorative programs. This shows that while community-based corrections have potential, they need to be part of a broader, more comprehensive strategy that addresses the root causes of crime and provides meaningful support for reintegration.